All right, I guess I'm recording. I see the red dot blinking. All right, this is Module 5. Hopefully, as I get more experience at this, I'll do better, and it'll be less of a snooze session for you students out there watching. I'm going to try to look at my PowerPoint and my notes a little bit less and look at you a little bit more, but you never know. I do get a little bit antsy here, and may need to. It's hard to lecture to an empty room. All right, so we're still doing a little bit of history, and we'll kind of race through that. Obviously, this is all to motivate our discussion online and in class on Thursday, 2 days from today as I record this. Later on today, as I'm recording this, you'll have your exam. So I'm not sure how that's going to turn out yet. I'll know that tomorrow. All right, so we got ourselves up to as far as World War II in the Module 4. And so now we're going to do Module 5, which is post-World War II and post-Sputnik. And for those of you not familiar with the term, Sputnik was the name of a Russian satellite that scared the bejeebers out of us, because we knew that militarily it helps to have the high ground, and there's nothing higher ground than outer space. Well, the Russians got up there first, and we were alarmed, and we put some of the blame on our education system, and indeed it belonged there, though it didn't produce exactly a productive response at the time. Other things that were going on at the time, after World War II and into the 1950s, was that school district consolidation continued big time. As you know, from the 1930s, there were well over 130-something thousand school districts, and today in the 21st century, there's probably around 15,000. So this process was underway, and the number of political jurisdictions was shrinking. By the way, this is not an answer to the overextended electorate problem, because everybody was still in one school district. That's one of the kinds of changes in the political landscape that doesn't help on that front. It really doesn't help on much of any front, because even though folks thought it would save on administration, it mostly just created more assistant superintendents for the superintendents that it saved. We got big, giant bureaucracies instead of lots of smaller ones. Obviously, some consolidation needed to happen because some of the school districts were just a few kids, but not 90% of the school districts going away by today. All right, other major things that were happening at the time was that separate but equal, which had been politically correct and will continue to be politically correct, well past the time of the 1954 Supreme Court decision, became judicially incorrect. The Supreme Court rejected it, and a very slow process was initiated in desegregating schools to the extent that was possible with geography, and given all the resistance that there was to the initial solution to it, which was to bus people around, sometimes long distances, so that more kids would sit next to other kids that were not the same race and ethnicity that they were. And it was assumed that just that very act of having kids sit next to other kids that were different from that would improve the schooling. As you know, that in and of itself doesn't do anything about the roots of the problem we've been talking about. So not surprisingly, while it did yield some benefits on the schooling front, simply because there were no longer the black schools to poorly fund and poorly staff. Now they were more often integrated schools. Beyond that, not a whole lot of improvement was realized. And curiously enough, the driving force 120 years ago was to create this common school along with denying Catholic subsidies. And now, 120 years later, the common school becomes the everything for everyone school. By the way, I briefly do read from the PowerPoints, and so right now I'm on the second one. So you may want to have your PowerPoint alongside here as you listen to me drone on through this recording that you've clicked off of your learning module. So instead of trying to make everybody more similar to everybody else in the melting pot effect, we had a school system with lots and lots of rules that prevented trying to homogenize people's cultures into a common school, a melting pot sort of environment. So we had an everyone's rights must be respected and recognized situation, not just because that seemed like a nice thing to do, but explicitly enforced that you couldn't try to get everybody on the in a more culturally homogeneous frame of mind. As it says here on slide number 2, is the opposite of the original common schools melting pot perspective. So not only do you have everybody's rights must be respected and recognized, you now increasingly had an everything for everyone large comprehensive school. And as I noted earlier, now that we're on slide 3, I see that slide 3 includes the mention of Hyman Rickover's 1951 book. Hyman Rickover was an admiral in the military, and he sounded the Cold War alarm on top of the Sputnik alarm that said, look, one of the reasons that we're having problems with schools, on top of not creating enough scientists to make satellites to keep up with the Russians, is we were having trouble staffing national security related things with folks whose loyalty was less likely to become an issue. So among other things, the Congress passed the Defense Education Act, and there was state level action, of course, in addition. But mostly what this did was it made it easier for the experts that were in control by design, remember from the progressive movement, it made it easier for them to finance the more costly items off of their wish list. And so with less resistance to their wish list, we enacted expensive things like smaller classes, better teacher training, better teacher pay. Again, those are all expensive. As you know, the teacher training is to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent an act of futility, because we're placing teachers into very difficult circumstances where we sort children still, even after this alarm, only by age and by neighborhood, and creating as much learning style, learning issue diversity as one can create in a classroom, and not expecting teachers to succeed and expecting teacher training to solve that problem when there probably isn't anything other than occasionally a magically gifted communicator that somehow managed to teach these children from all these different perspectives reasonably well. Slide 4 is, of course, the reading list. Slide 5 talks about school choice getting a black eye. What does that mean? Well, that means that one of the things that was done to resist segregation through busing was to create voucher laws, but not the kind of voucher laws that we like, the kind that don't discriminate, but voucher laws that make it easier just for whites to escape schools about to undergo desegregation. So these programs were deployed to defy the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision and to maintain segregation, but now between publicly funded private schools and public schools increasingly enrolled by black children being bused out of their mostly inner city neighborhoods. Eventually, the Supreme Court struck these down for these discriminatory non-universal voucher laws were struck down, but notably the Supreme Court did not address the voucher concept as an attack, a desirable attack on the schools, the public finance monopoly of public schools. So the Supreme Court decision struck down the white-only choice, but they did not comment on the voucherization of school subsidies, which they eventually addressed in 2002 in the Zellman decision, where by a narrow 5-4 margin, the Supreme Court said that as long as the government didn't favor any particular schools as they had with the laws that were enacted in the 50s and early 60s, as long as they didn't do that, then by 5-4 margin at least, it was okay to voucherize school funding and let parents decide where to take the portable part of the school taxes that they had paid. As an interesting side note, this Supreme Court case in 2002, the eventual Zellman decision, was widely and mistakenly seen as a test of the constitutionality of vouchers. This is an important lesson in the ability or the difficulty escaping being an intellectual prisoner of the status quo. You see, at the time, in the early 2000s, and still true to this day in most places, most private schools are run by churches. So it follows, at least to a lot of people, that if you make it illegal to have for church-run schools to cash vouchers or to receive subsidies, even indirectly through parental choice, then it seems, well, if all the schools are run by churches, or almost all the private schools are run by churches, well, that was, in effect, would make school choice or making subsidies portable would make that illegal. Wrong. Certainly, it would have been a huge blow to church-run schooling, and it would have been a huge blow had the Supreme Court decision not gone narrowly in favor of that vouchers can be used, can be spent, can be cashed by church-run schools. Certainly, it would have been a huge blow to church-run schools, but if vouchers then can be used at non-church-run private schools, the Supreme Court decision would not have prevented that had it gone 5-4 the other way. Then, with a large enough vouchers and the ability to top off those vouchers, there would have been huge market entry by private schooling without a religious content. Anyway, that's an interesting sidebar because sometimes the nature of the status quo gives people a notion that isn't actually true. Another notion on the same in the same vein is, well, gosh, 90% of kids attend public schools now. So how can school system reform work unless it dramatically improves the public schools? Well, it's another one of those ends, means, confusions, and other intellectual prisoner of the status quo issue. Certainly, because change is difficult, it would be desirable to dramatically improve the performance of the system of traditional public schools. But if that's not possible, either politically or because they just can't improve themselves, which is not an unusual condition throughout history for both public and private entities, they just typically cannot reform themselves and gradually are replaced. But if that's the case, well, then they will gradually be replaced, and school system reform can occur without dramatic improvement in traditional public schools, simply by people voting with their feet, taking their subsidies with them if there are any subsidies, if the school system isn't just privatized, and gradually the public school system would wane away and be replaced by privately run profit and nonprofit schooling. All right, so that was a little bit of a digression. Another little digression regarding the school choice black eye here on slide 7 in the Module 5 PowerPoint is that it's somewhat ironic, given that those who resist reform, especially reform driven by school choice, that when they mention this terrible chapter in the history of school choice where it was used as a way to sustain segregation, and it was provided only to those who wanted to escape the integration of their schools, it's interesting that now, especially given the unpopularity of busing, that integration is often pursued not with busing, but with school choice. Now, as a sidebar to the sidebar, there's not much trust of the parents in these schemes. But it is school choice. It is parents being lured out of the inner city or into the edge of the inner city by things like magnet schools, and by sometimes, for example, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in part of Boston, parents are lured out of their assigned school into other schools by the availability of public school choice and differences, including some specialization, encouraged, so that parents would have a reason to make a choice other than their closest school. Now, the sidebar to the sidebar is that, well, given that the goal was integration, although integration was a goal because it supposedly mattered, and to some extent certainly does matter to school performance, to children learning more than they otherwise would, families had to submit their choice of school to a public authority and they may not get their first choice if it's not consistent with the integration plan. Now think about that a little bit. Integration was supposedly done to improve school system outcomes, to make it so children would learn more, be a better schooling environment. Then their parents come along and say, okay, great. Yeah, here's the menu of choices I have. I want this school. Oh, and then the authorities say, well, that doesn't make up our racial mix well enough. So we have a situation where the authorities overrule their parents' judgment to some extent. And their parents' judgment is based on what will be best for their child's learning environment, given their child's characteristics. And the authorities say, no, that's the indirect effect, if any, through improved integration is more important than the engagement that may result from parents matching their children up to the schooling circumstances that would work best for their children. Interesting priorities, as it says on Chapter 8, on Slide 8. Just basically what I said a minute ago here on Slide 8. Academic preferences from families likely to have the critical co-production / engagement effects take a back seat to the integration goals assumed to be academic performance related, but with no evidence to support that assumption for TPS. I underlined that on Slide 8 because, well, again, TPS means traditional public school, because it may be that integration would matter more in some of these, if it weren't just moving children around among low-functioning roots of the problem, ubiquitous, trying to piece the words together there, a system of schools where the roots of the problem is everywhere. So again, consider that. No evidence to support that assumption for TPS means that, well, because TPS are low performing, it may be that the integration doesn't matter all that much. Shifting schools among shifting children among low performing schools may not have that big of an effect. However, if the schools were not traditional public schools and they were higher performing, perhaps specialized schools of choice, then movement among the schools, whether by choice or by any other means, might make a much bigger difference. Again, don't be an intellectual prisoner of the status quo and assume that evidence that's generated by studying traditional public school systems is necessarily going to be telling for how the same kind of a scheme or policy might work in a different system of schools. All right, we're up to Slide 9 out of 14. This is one of the shorter ones. We'll get into the longer ones again later. We'll spend some time here on October 9th, spend some time reviewing the exam as well as this short PowerPoint for a discussion of this short PowerPoint for Module 5. The 1960s, as you probably know from your history classes, was a very tumultuous period. The Vietnam War, racial conflict, desegregation battles, riots. And as you know, there was considerable resistance by families to having their children be on buses for hours every day just for the achievement of racial balance, which was often not seen as widely or solidly connected to improved performance, especially by some of the children bused into the inner city where it was seen as something that might reduce their performance. So another thing that was going on in the 60s is there was a lot of high SES flight, and reading in that literally because you may be looking at SES saying, what on earth is SES? It's an abbreviation for socioeconomic status. So high SES flight to the suburbs means that the white-collar folks, which is typically a synonym for those with higher income white-collar folks moving to the suburbs to escape the desegregation that was going on among the existing schools. So new towns, new areas were forming as families moved outside the existing city to suburbs to make it to get far enough away from where busing didn't seem like it's something that they would have to tolerate for their children. At the same time, because of the everything for everybody, and we're not going to tell anybody that their culture is anything other than what they should sustain forever, we're going to give up on the melting pot. Because of all of that, there was the emergence of the comprehensively uniform shopping mall high school that I've mentioned, and for that matter, even below high school, to a lesser extent, the comprehensively uniform traditional public school, generally, though not as big below high school as the mega high schools that we were building at the time. And because the political process was not working well locally, and just some rehashing a little bit of Module 4, the tumultuous 1960s saw increasing shift of influence and power and authority and regulation from local to state and even federal level. So the federal level, it wasn't too much of that going on yet. Much more of it now. At the same time, perhaps as partly due to the deteriorating labor market conditions because of school district consolidation, can you say monopsony, right? Many areas went from multiple districts competing for teachers to a single or maybe one dominant district employing teachers. That put teachers in a very awkward, powerless circumstance. And that probably, I haven't seen anything that says that for sure, probably helped create the climate that helped teachers gain a foothold. And so anyway, that happened in the 1960s. And part of the problem that arose with the increasing teacher influence was, of course, political. They became very influential politically. You know that in a overextended electorate situation, the unions can wield a lot of power by focusing on the one arena where the teachers and educators generally are most interested, namely school-related, school board, school district, and state board of education, and legislators that are particularly active on schooling policy. They can focus on those and very readily become a swing vote that can pretty much call the shots on who can be elected. Now, as you know from a couple of modules ago, you know that Eric Hanushek has discovered that the United States would improve enough to be world class if we would just replace our worst 5 to 8% of teachers with average teachers. Why haven't we done that? Well, there you have it on slide 10, where it says the rise of teacher unions, as it says right at the top, made it harder to fire lousy teachers. And some school districts have what I think they call in New York the rubber rooms, where, well, they don't fire the teachers, they just take them out of the classroom, but they keep paying them. Well, I suppose that's of some benefit to the children, assuming that the new teacher that they face is at least more functional than the one that was removed, but it's certainly expensive to have lots and lots of employed but idle teachers sitting around. All right, so we're on slide 11 out of 14. Having discussed now a lot of things that changed during this tumultuous period after World War II and into the 70s, what stayed the same? Well, as I noted earlier, school districts became bigger and scarcer. Not only did that become problematic for teachers in securing employment, by that I mean, of course, there was still the same demand for teachers, but by fewer employers, and so it was less competitive. What also stayed the same, let me say a little bit more about that. Not only does that create a problem for teachers, the fact that there are fewer school districts creates a problem for parents. Unless you can pay twice, the only way to exercise school choice is to choose among school attendance areas within a district or to choose among school districts. Here in the San Antonio area, there hasn't been as much school district consolidation. We still have 15 districts. And occasionally there's pressure because of that to consolidate some of them. But at least, to some extent, we can compare what different districts are doing and improve political accountability as a result of that. You can say, why aren't you doing what district? Well, if they can do it, why can't we do it over here? So inability to make those comparisons by consolidating all the districts reduces performance. You may have heard of Charles Thibault, T-I-E-B-O-U-T. He calls competition between political jurisdictions, well, he didn't call it that, but other people have called it that since his 1956 article, T-bill competition is not the same thing as market competition, but it's still useful. It's still helpful to have political jurisdictions competing for tax base and for businesses. All right, so that stayed the same. T-bill competition would continue to shrink. Teacher labor markets continued to be uncompetitive and become less competitive. There continued to be price control. That is, there were no price signals. The things that we minimally recognize and largely take for granted as the driving force of most industries continue to be absent in schooling. And by the way, I've added or actually revised my auto signature to pose the following question. So I'll pose that here. It starts with a statement, but it sort of amounts to a question. Schooling is not going to be the first successful price-controlled industry. There's nothing about it to say that it's going to do that, and in fact, it exhibits all of the standard, terrible, ugly symptoms of price control. So, if you accept that schooling is not going to be the one industry that can perform at a high level, because no other industry ever has, without price signals and profit and loss to add consequence to those price signals, that means if you accept that, then you have to start thinking about, well, what are we going to do to have price decontrol? Oops, I walked off the screen there for a minute. And if you do believe that schooling is unique in a way that makes price signals unnecessary or counterproductive, then you have to make that case. Again, there have been no successful price-controlled industries. Schooling is not yet an example of that. Perhaps it will be, perhaps it can be. I doubt it. So that stayed the same. Still no price signals in K through 12 school systems to inform, to motivate, to do what they do in an almost magical process to do what they do for most of the economy. There were still no tangible rewards or penalties for educator success or failure, and for that matter, in a lot of cases for student success or failure, until, of course, they get out of school and have not enough tangible skills to work with. Well, then there are tangible penalties or smaller rewards for their smaller skills. And there are still attendance zones to assign children to school, which is significant because it precludes the specialization that we need to address the diversity of educators and children, so that the educators can create specialized schools of choice, and parents and children can choose among them based on what engages them in productive learning. All right, I covered that first part of slide 12 already. One of the things that stayed the same is, unless you can pay twice, the only way to make a school choice is to change where you live. And notably, once this process had been in place for a while, higher housing prices in these zones around the better schools. And then that creates a barrier to access for those with lesser means. So gradually we have a system evolving that was in large part justified, right? Free schooling, so that the poorest of the poor would have access to a high quality schooling experience. That was the justification, to a system now where higher housing prices in the areas around better schools prevent lower income families from accessing the better schools and keep them confined in zones around the worst schools. And I know I'm committing the one-dimension fallacy that I periodically condemn. What we're talking about in many cases here is not a school that's good for some and not for others, although that's mostly the case. But the low-income families were often consigned to schools that worked for nobody, that were so bad that they were just utterly dysfunctional, and it wasn't a matter of, well, they worked for some people but not for others. They weren't working for much of anyone. And they were stuck there because the housing was more expensive in the better schools that at least worked for some of the children assigned to them. All right, so in the 1970s, some of the trends were going from bad to worse. We have now teacher union contracts on top of all the other regulations generated by the political process. So we have increased bureaucracy, more fragmentation of authority between local, state, and federal levels, more race consciousness in hiring and enrollment, and those compounded the performance eroding factors cited earlier this semester. Interestingly, at least I found it interesting when I discovered it in my studies of this in the last couple of decades, political liberals, Democrats, were briefly the champions of school choice beyond residential choice. So, for example, if you read closely, you can find political liberals, members of the Democratic Party in the late 60s, advocating for school choice so that low-income families could get out of the attendance zones of their often horrible inner-city assigned traditional public schools. But that didn't last long. The Democrat Party was forced into a choice between teacher unions that wanted to keep the system that made them powerful pretty much the same, and thus did not want transformational change. The Democrat Party had to choose between them and being the voice of the disadvantaged, and who to this day are strong proponents of school choice. But for the time being, the Democrat hierarchy seems to have made a wise choice from their perspective for their political party, because they didn't lose a whole lot of the low SES disadvantaged population that they thought that they might lose more of by siding more specifically with the teacher unions. It's interesting to watch sometimes that folks that clamor for school choice still, when they go to the ballot box, they make political choices not consistent with that. In other words, who they vote for, what they vote for, is not yet driven by the disadvantaged groups, Black, Hispanic, for example, low income generally, is not yet driven to any great extent by their wish for increased school choice. So they vote for school choice opponents at the same time they clamor for more school choice. But at least for now, the fact that it's a source of significant Democratic Party internal stress, and that and the teacher dissension against union resistance to transformation, those are big sources of internal stress, and occasionally it surfaces with a person or policy that wants to get out from underneath this resistance to reform, but so far it hasn't happened in any big way. But we can only hope, that is, those of us who believe that transformational change is needed can only hope that this stress produces decreased resistance, in fact, maybe even increased interest in some transformational change that would allow for a dynamic menu of schooling options that we need for our diverse educators and our diverse children.